Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 1725. The topic is training, and the title is Weight Load versus Weekly Volume. I got into a good discussion with one of my newer clients. She's a wellness competitor. In wellness, they get on stage, they have to be super shredded, super lean, and they're not going to be as shredded as, say male bodybuilders or women's physique, but they're still very, 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 very lean for what people would consider to be lean. Very lean. But they're lower body dominant, so they're judged based on the glutes being thicker, the thighs being thicker. They still want to have like a tapered in waist. They want to have kind of like pronounced shoulder caps and good back detail, but their upper body shouldn't be as muscular as their lower body is. So it's a very kind of unique category. You can do a quick little search on YouTube if you want. You can type IFBB wellness competitor or, amateur wellness competitor, and you get an idea of what the body type looks like. But for that client, I had sent her her programs, her new program. We're 2 weeks into it, and we've been discussing things back and forth, and one of the things she asked was, why is each muscle trained so differently? Her previous coach's program, in my opinion, was trash. And I feel like he just sent her like the same thing he sends anyone. But it was a push-pull legs sequence. So she had, the first workout was chest first. A lot of like 3 or 4 exercises, 3 or 4 sets, like even drop sets in there, but a ton of chest work. Then some shoulders, then triceps. The next day was back, abs, and biceps. The next day was quads, hamstrings, and calves. And then she repeated that, so 6 days in a row, and then she took Sundays off. That is, in my opinion, a pretty crappy program for a wellness competitor. In contrast, my program, day 1, is glutes and abs, then shoulders and upper back. Day 2 is glutes, hamstrings, and quads. Day 3, we go back to glutes and abs, and then shoulders and upper back. Day 4, we go back to glutes, hams, and quads. And then she talked about Fridays being kind of challenging for her for personal reasons and whatnot. So we use Fridays as an active recovery. Like if she can go for a walk that day, great. If she goes, out with her dog, whatever she might want to do. But she's active recovery on Friday. So be busy, move around some, but we don't have to lift weights. Then on Saturday, we go in and we do a full body workout. The lower body is all basically body weight components. And then the upper body, we do actually do a little bit of weight again for the week, but it's not as many isolation type movements. They're more compound movements. The idea of that is we stimulate all the muscles again. Lower body is body weight, upper body definitely using some weight, but we do more complex movements. She might do, like walking lunges and then a variation of a burpee with a bent over row blended together. And it's just all this goofy fun stuff, but she has a gymnastics background, so she loves it. And then the Sunday, we do another active day. Just, don't lift any weights, go for a 10-minute walk, do what you got to do, but no lifting weights. So that structure is very different. So again, her previous coach's program was chest, shoulders, triceps, day 1, back, abs, biceps, day 2, quads, hamstrings, calves, day 3, then she repeated all that. The program I wrote was day 1 is glutes and abs, shoulders and upper back. Day 2 is glutes, hamstrings, quads. Day 3 and 4, repeat day 1 and 2. We have an active day of recovery, then we have full body workout, then an active day of recovery. So the idea of wellness, again, is that you want to have bigger thighs and glutes, especially the glutes. You want to have a pronounced shoulder cap, and you have to have good, well-defined upper back muscles. You want to have some detail in there with a V taper, which means you don't want to build the lower part of the lats. You want the upper back to basically look like a V from the waist up to the shoulders. Now, what's interesting is, as we talked about it, the glutes are trained 4 days in a row. There's a day off, then they're somewhat involved but not overly isolated in day 6, and then there's another day off. But the 4 days in a row, it might seem a little crazy to train your glutes 4 days in a row. So if we look at the title of today's podcast is weight load versus weekly volume. The weekly volume for the glutes is high. When weekly volume is high, you actually want the weight load to go down. You want it to be lower. So on days 1 and 3, we do glutes and abs before we do shoulders and upper back. Those are actually just body weight exercises. So the glutes and abs are body weight, like single leg glute bridges and variations of that kind of stuff. But days 1 and 3, it's not super heavy stuff that's straining the muscle and tearing it apart and, creating a lot of damage. So days 1 and 3 is body weight glute work. That's a light weight load. Days 2 and 4, we do heavy glute work. So she does 2 heavy days a week, 2 days where she does isolated movements, but they're at body weight or really low weight load. And then that one other time of the week where the glutes are involved, but they're not isolated out and targeted specifically. So the weekly volume is high. And that makes sense because it's the most prioritized muscle of what we want to change. But the weight load varies. So that way we don't overtrain the tissues, the muscle tissues and the connective tissues, where we wouldn't provide enough time for the body to use the food we're giving it to actually rebuild and thicken those tissues. So it's a balance. If you do high frequency, high weekly volume, you're typically going to do lighter weight loads. Not necessarily that you can't do heavy days, you just maybe only have 2 heavy days out of 4 total days, right? Like I have there. The second priority in her programming is her hamstrings and quadriceps. So we do hamstrings and quadriceps twice per week with heavy weights and then once with just body weight stuff. What's interesting about her hamstrings and quadriceps is on those movements, she can move a ton of weight. A ton of weight on, hack squat, leg press, variations of lunges, like machine-based lunges. So we're doing like Bulgarian split squats on a Smith machine. So she can do pretty good weight loads. So since the weight loads are heavy, she doesn't need as much frequency. And I'm going to come back and kind of balance this all in a second. But comparatively to her shoulders and upper back, the shoulders and upper back, they're the next priority in the list. And they're trained twice per week with heavy days. And then on that day 6, when we're doing lower body with just body weight, we're still doing the upper body with weighted weight loads. So she is using resistance training for the upper body on day 6. The reason why is since her upper body, she can try her best, but she's not going to be able to move as heavy of weight loads as she can with her thighs. So, since the weekly volume is going to be the same in regards to frequency, we might actually still need more weight load, though, on the upper body on that 3rd day, because she can't achieve as much weight load as she achieves with her hamstrings and quadriceps in just the first 2 days. So it's a balancing act. The higher the priority of the muscle, the higher the frequency should be. But the higher the frequency is, the less often you need heavy weight load. So it can be challenging. It can be a little kind of hard to understand, hard to balance. But it's all just kind of tweaking and living and learning and practicing it. So if your goal is muscle growth, if something is a high priority and you can train it really heavy, then you might train it maybe 2 to 3 times per week. If something's a high priority, but you can't train it as heavy, think of like trying to grow the middle deltoids. You want to grow your shoulders for width, but you're never going to be able to train your shoulders as heavy as you would be able to train your thighs, right? So you might train smaller muscles that are still high priorities 3 to 4 times a week. So high priority, bigger muscles that you can use heavier weights, only 2 to 3 times. High priority, smaller muscles that you can't use as heavy of weight, you might need 3 or 4 times. So if the weight load is down, the weekly volume, the frequency has to go up. If you're talking about lower priority muscles, if they're lower priority, smaller muscles, you might need once or twice a week. If they're low priority but strong, like big muscles that you can move really heavy weights, maybe once a week, that's it, since they're low priority. So you might have some muscles that are once per week other muscles that are twice, others that are 3, and even some muscles that are 4 times per week. Her previous program, she was training every single muscle the exact frequency, the same exact frequency, the same amount of times per week. The working sets were trash, by the way. I'm not even going to get into that. But the greatest level of working set she had was a balance between her chest, her quadriceps, and hamstrings. The coach didn't even isolate out her glutes, for God's sake. And chest was tied for the most volume. You got to be kidding me. So, trash programming. That coach did not write a wellness athlete program. They just gave a program that they had for probably who knows what other client, and this made that client follow it. So very bummed about that. Very, very sad for the client. But that's the idea. If you prioritize muscles differently, they should be trained differently. So when we go back to what the client asked me, they said, why is each muscle trained so differently? And what they were talking about was, why are my glutes so often, but I don't have any chest at all? I don't see any biceps and triceps. So they were like, what's up? Like, why is this so far different? And the reason is we need to prioritize the muscles differently because we're trying to develop a specific look. So therefore, if we're prioritizing the muscles differently, they should be trained differently. If I don't need biceps and triceps as much as I need glutes, I shouldn't be training my biceps and triceps as much as I train my glutes. Does that make sense, right? So it feels like common sense, but it's a bummer because when she would look at her previous program, she left the coach because the coach wasn't communicating with her enough. And we just happened to talk about her programming, and the programming was not good. But she didn't know that because she was just like, well, this coach, I told him I was doing wellness, and he sent me a program that he said would work for wellness. So she followed what the coach said, and unfortunately the coach lied to her. So it's helpful for us if we're writing our own programming, or if we're following programming written by someone. It's good for us to have an understanding of what the programming should look like. So if I have goals and things that are a certain priority, like the higher priority than another thing, then I should be doing it more often. I know that sounds like common sense, but it isn't. Sometimes we just overly trust. So it's good for us to have a little bit of awareness on our own, so that way we can kind of understand when we have a good program or not so good program, and you can either modify it and correct it, or you can learn to go find somebody else's programming. But that is something I wanted to discuss, is just the weight load versus weekly volume. The difference that if you prioritize muscles differently, they should be trained differently. You should not be training everything the same if you don't want them to look the same, right? If you want certain things to grow more than other things, they need to be trained differently. Okay, thought that was a fun discussion. Hopefully it was interesting, gave you something to think of. If you have any follow-up questions, shoot me an email at brutaliron@gmail.com. If you like our podcast, please share the podcast. If you like the podcast, please consider donating to support the podcast, which you can do on our website. If you like the information we share in the podcast, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube. You can find us and follow us under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.